Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with Pat Williams, the Senior Vice President of the Orlando Magic, is brought to you by Compassion International. For $38 a month, you get a chance to release a child from poverty. We love Compassion. We're so grateful to have them as a sponsor, as a partner here on this podcast and with Sports Spectrum's media brands, including our website and our magazine. And Compassion, listen, they've been doing it for 66 years. And they found that the most effective way to care for children in need is through the local church. That's why they partner with more than 7,000 local churches in 25 countries to deliver God's love and care to children in need, one child at a time. Today, more than 2 million children are breaking the cycle of poverty for good through Compassion International. They provide food, education, medical care, safe housing. It's just awesome what Compassion is about. And you can get involved right now by sponsoring a child through Compassion. Here's the website, compassion.com/sportspectrum. Compassion.com/sportspectrum. $38 a month. Make room for one more in your home by sponsoring a child today through Compassion and releasing them from poverty. Today on the podcast, we welcome Pat Williams, the Senior Vice President of the Orlando Magic. Pat is truly a treasure. 51 years in the NBA. What a legend. He's written over 100 books. He's on book number 110 that I'll tell you about in a second. Pat started out his professional career at 27 years old, president of the Spartanburg Phillies minor league team. He was a general manager then with the Atlanta Hawks, with the Philadelphia 76ers, where they won a title, an NBA title in 1983 with Philadelphia and Dr. J and Moses Malone and those guys. He went to the Orlando Magic in 1989 and has been there ever since its inception. He's a motivational speaker. He is a father to 19 children with his wife, Ruth. 19. And he's also a cancer survivor and the 2012 recipient of the John W. Bunn Lifetime Achievement Award from the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. He's a treasure, Pat. He's a legend. And every time I'm offered the opportunity to have him on the podcast, I'm going to say yes, because the man is just so full of wisdom. He's like a sage, like this legend that you just want to sit and listen to. Kind of reminds me of my grandfather. You know, when I sat and just listened to my grandfather share words of wisdom and stories through the years. I mean, that's Pat Williams through and through. And listen, he's the father of 19 children, 14 adopted children. He has 17 grandchildren as well. And like I said, a legend, writing 110 books. And book number 110 is his latest, called Character Carved in Stone. And it's a really great read about leadership, and the foreword written by Mike Krzyzewski, the Duke basketball coach, also a legend in his own right. So let's get to it. Pat Williams, the legend, the Senior Vice President of the Orlando Magic, joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Take a listen. And we welcome Pat to the program. Pat, welcome back to the show.
Jason, good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me, and hope things are well with you.
Yeah, things are doing great, Pat, and it's always an honor to have you back on. And I'm excited because you've written, I don't know what number book this is, but I know we're in the triple digits here with the Character Carved in Stone book that you wrote. What number book is this, Pat?
Well, actually, Jason, it's 110, believe it or not. Don't ask me how it happened, but it did. And
it's awesome. No, I'm excited about the book, and the foreword's written by Coach K, Mike Krzyzewski. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write Character Carved in Stone?
Well, Jason, here's the backstory. Several years ago, I was invited to go to West Point and speak to the athletes, the men and women sports teams there, and the coaches. And after I finished that, I got a tour of the campus at West Point, which is a powerful experience. We ended up at a little park on the campus called Trophy Point. It looks out over the Hudson River, a beautiful setting. And as we toured through this little park, I noticed a bench. Well, I guess every park has a bench, but as I looked further, I saw more benches, and I counted them. and there were 12 of them, all the same, identical. And I thought, boy, that's kind of unusual. Is there anything about these benches beyond just benches? Well, I looked at one of the benches and I saw a word carved into the end of the bench. And I looked around on the other end of the bench and the same word was carved there. And that prompted me to go to another bench, and I saw the same carving, but a different word. And I checked out all 12 benches, and I saw words like courage and dignity and discipline and integrity and loyalty and trust, those kind of words. And then my thought was, boy, there's got to be a backstory here. Well, there was. The class at West Point of 1934, on their 50th anniversary in 1984, they gave those benches as a gift to the school.
Wow. And
the words were selected by this class in 1934. And you think about that for a minute. They were in World War II. They would have been in the Korean War. I mean, those guys had been through it.
Yeah.
And they picked these 12 words because they felt that's what all future cadets should really live by. So my immediate reaction was, boy, I'd never heard this before. This has got to be a well-kept secret. And we went to the publisher and said, here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to write a chapter on each one of those words and then find a West Point graduate who best models that word. That was our strategy. Well, the publisher liked it, and that's exactly what we did. We did go to Coach K, who's a West Point grad, and asked him to do the foreword, and he agreed to do that. And thus the book is just out, Jason, and that's the background, and that's how it came about.
I love it. Many of these values, too, Pat, because you and I, this is a faith in sports podcast. Many of these values are biblical. I mean, compassion, courage, dedication, integrity, loyalty, service, trust. That sounds a lot like this Jesus guy that you and I know, huh?
Jason, I don't think there's any question about that. Every one of these words you can find embedded somewhere in Scripture. And Jesus, of course, would have modeled all of them, the greatest leader who ever lived. And these West Point grads, are really encouraged to model these words, and above all, get prepared for a life of leadership. When I visit at West Point, Jason, everything hits on two things that you just feel it: leadership and teamwork. It's just in the air up there. You breathe it. You're just absolutely covered with it when you go there. Leadership and teamwork. And obviously they come out and, are going to be leading in our military, and they lead in other areas of life. But the good news is we can all benefit from this and increase our ability as leaders.
Absolutely. Pat Williams is our guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. You said this is book number 110, and the essence of writing books is, of course, storytelling. Tell us a story from this book, maybe one of your favorite stories that you were able to tell in this book.
Well, on the word compassion, Jason, we featured General Ulysses S. Grant, which probably would shock people because he was a hard-nosed general that finally got the Union victory assured, but and went by the nickname by many Butcher Grant. But as we've studied Grant, he really was a man of compassion. He had a great heart for his soldiers. He had compassion and love for his wife. They had a marvelous marriage. He had compassion for horses, for animals. At West Point, he was considered a top-level horseman, and that carried on through his military career. There was one example during the war. He saw on the side of the road a soldier who was just whipping and beating his horse to death, just killing him, just butchering him. And Grant got off his horse. He was beyond angry, and he got a hold of that young soldier and just reamed him. If I ever see you doing this again, you will pay for it. And boy, he was upset to see that horse being abused. So I think that word compassion does fit for Grant. When I see compassion, Jason, in leadership, I think immediately of people skills. Great leaders, when you study them, have people skills. That means they have a heart for people. They care about people. They're interested in people. They have empathy for people. They really love people. Well, that's what I've learned about people skills, compassion. I think that's where I get off on it.
Pat Williams is our guest. The book, again, is called Character Carved in Stone. Coach K, Mike Krzyzewski, wrote the foreword. It's available in bookstores everywhere. I'm excited about reading this one. I got my own copy here, Pat, and I'm excited to check it out. Let's talk a little NBA for a second while we have you. And I know you shared in our last podcast, our previous podcast interview, about starting professional basketball chapel. I was wondering if you could kind of share that story again and maybe go a little deeper in the impact that has made not only on your own life, but on the life of so many in the NBA. We have a lot of chaplains on this podcast, and just what the motivation was in going to start it way back when and maybe where it is today.
Well, Jason, here's what I recall. It was the summer of 1978, and I was the general manager of the 76ers in Philadelphia. We made a trade that summer. We traded George McGinnis, a big power forward, to Denver. And in exchange, we got Bobby Jones back from Denver. Bobby came to me that summer when he came to Philadelphia, and he said, I would like to start a chapel program, with our team. Can you help me? Well, I took it upon myself on the first Sunday home game, and that would then be February of 79. I found a room at the Spectrum, and I invited a speaker to come in. His name was Mel Floyd, a former policeman there, had a ministry. And we invited, Milwaukee was in town, and we invited them. So long story short, Bobby was there, and so was Julius Erving. And assistant coach Chuck Daly came. And Kent Benson, the center for the Bucks, was there. That was, and me. And I introduced Mel Floyd, and he delivered his message. And my memory is that would have been the first official chapel service, in the NBA. That's my recall of it. Well, Norm Sanju, right in that period, had brought an expansion team to Dallas. And Norm, a strong, solid Christian guy, dear friend, talked to me about, I wonder if we could have an all-star chapel service. So Norm and I put our heads together, and in February of 1981, we had our first all-star chapel service in Cleveland. We got a room at the hotel and got the word out and invited people. We were thrilled. Andre Thornton was our speaker, the Cleveland Indians slugger. And it was Norm and I were absolutely thrilled with the outcome of that event. Well, we've continued ever since. We had our I don't know, we're getting close to 40 years. We had our most recent one in Charlotte this past February, and that we had a wonderful event. And next year we're in Chicago, and we're getting things lined up for that. That would be February of what?
2020.
And and the NBA has been very supportive. I mean, we're so pleased. They put it on the weekend calendar, and they get a room for us, and they provide a nice little breakfast for people, and it's just turned into a wonderful event. But that All-Star weekend all started in 1981, and Norm and I originally worked on it together. Norm retired from the NBA many years back, and the Magic and our crew here have continued doing it, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Can you share some of the names now, maybe because the guys that are currently playing, I know there's some privacy and certainly some guys. We've had Jonathan Isaac on this podcast, and he's a young man who's very outspoken about his faith. But maybe some of the guys, you mentioned Julius Erving. I think people know who Dr. J is, but maybe many people don't know about Dr. J's faith. And there's a few others, I'm sure, over your time, some guys that were really great players, but faith was a big part of their life, and you saw them impacted by that faith during their career. Can you share a couple of those?
Well, last month at the chapel service, Jerry Colangelo, longtime Phoenix Suns GM, was there.
Sure.
So was Donnie Nelson, the GM of the Dallas Mavericks. David Robinson was there. And so was Kevin Johnson. And so was Paul Westphal. And so was Lionel Hollins. He was there.
Yeah.
And Rick Barry and his wife attended. We thought that was terrific. And so currently, I don't keep up with all of it, but Jonathan Isaac is a second-year player here with us, played at Florida State. And we're really pleased. Jonathan's faith is real, and he has a certain boldness about it. He's just a young guy. He's 20 years old.
Yeah.
And so we feel very, very solid about that. Steph Curry with the Warriors is very solid in his faith, and his younger brother, who plays for Portland, grew up and has good, solid Christian values. Del Curry, the longtime Charlotte player, loves the Lord and has a strong testimony. So we're very pleased in the NBA. James Borrego, who is the head coach of the Charlotte Hornets, is a strong, very, very bold Christian, and we're pleased that he's getting an opportunity to be a head coach. Those are just a few thoughts, Jason.
Pat, tell me about your thoughts on just sort of intermixing this world of being a Christian, a man of faith. We live in a world where sometimes that's frowned upon, and yet you have a high, prominent role within a secular organization, obviously in the Orlando Magic, where we're not called to preach our faith to people, but we're called to live that out wherever we go. How do you kind of balance both of those worlds for all the years that you've been involved in sports, professional, specifically with the NBA?
Well, Jason, as I look back, I came to know Christ in February of 1968. I was 27 years old, and I was running the Phillies minor league ball club in Spartanburg, South Carolina. The home, by the way, of one Zion Williamson.
That's right.
That's an aside. And I had a dramatic conversion experience, and my reaction was, Lord, my life is yours. I'm going to take my hands off it. I'm not going to try and maneuver and try and work my way to the top of the sports industry. I'm in your hands. Well, I don't know, about 4 months later, my whole life and career changed dramatically when I was offered a job to run the front office for the 76ers basketball team. My whole life had been in baseball. So there I was at 28 years old, and the Lord removed me from Spartanburg, and I landed in Philadelphia. And 1 year later, he moves me again, this time to Chicago. I had nothing to do with any of this. Didn't know about it. And 4 years later, I end up in Atlanta, which I knew nothing about. And a year later, the Lord up and moved me back to Philadelphia for 12 years. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, I'm invited to come down here and head up an expansion effort in Orlando, Florida, 33 years ago. My point is, I learned that when you take your hands off your life and turn it over completely to the Lord and don't get in his way, he will direct your paths. I don't know. People say, well, how can you be a Christian and still operate? I don't know how I could operate without being a Christian. The ups and downs and the turmoil of this business, the turnover, the high of the wins, and the low of the losses. I don't know how you could survive without being a Christian. Having said that, Jason, our job is not Well, let me put it this way. To be a Christian in this business, you do not have to be weird.
Right.
You do not have to offend people. You don't have to act like a crazed maniac. You don't have to be spouting Bible verses everywhere you turn. I think the main thing you do is do a good job.
Yeah.
You know, this is my 51st year in the NBA, and I wouldn't be here for 2 years if you don't produce and do your job. And our job in this business is very simple: win games and sell tickets.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for. And I don't care whether you're a Hindu or whether you're a charismatic Christian or a Southern Baptist. You know, you've got to get the job done. And however, this business, Jason, we're in a sports crazy nation. This country is just absolutely riveted by sports.
Yeah.
And coaches and players and executives and broadcasters, boy, we have a platform. And I've always felt it was important to take advantage of that platform. And when you have opportunities to speak or address crowds or whatever. Now, in our case here, it sure helps to have Christian ownership.
Right.
The DeVos family has owned this team now for almost 30 years. The patriarch, Rich DeVos, passed away in September, but he was solid in his faith. And his family follows in the same way. So it sure helps when you've got an ownership group but that hasn't always been the case for me. But it certainly helps. It's wonderful to have that. It's rare, by the way, in our business.
Yeah.
But it's been great for me.
Pat, a couple more questions here as we wind down on the Sports Spectrum podcast, and just always appreciate your time and your generosity. This may be a question that you've already answered in your last answer to my question, but I still want to ask it because I think it might spurn a different type of response. What's the greatest lesson that you've learned in your 50 years in sports? You have a lot of lessons. I mean, you've written 110 books. There's tons of wisdom there. But if you could sum it up, what's the greatest lesson? And maybe it's a faith-based lesson. Maybe it's just a lesson that you've learned being in the NBA for over 50 years. But what is that great lesson that you've learned if you could take away and maybe put it on your headstone someday?
Don't waste your sufferings. I think that would be it.
Explain.
Because in sports or in life, we're going to have setbacks. We're going to have heartache. We're going to have death in our families. We're going to have job loss. We're going to have divorce. We're going to have cancer diagnosis. I have had all of them.
Yeah.
But my point is that through those tough times, that's when we really grow. That's when we really advance. That's when God teaches us, because we have such a teachable spirit during the tough times. We're clinging to Him because there's nowhere else to turn. When everything is going great, when we're winning titles and books are selling out and everything is perfect, I don't think we learn a lot. We become very self-sufficient. Our attitude is probably, well, I'm good at this. I'm doing all this. But boy, when the floodgates hit, and they do, with every one of us, they hit. And that's the time we're really going to grow. And we don't want to waste those hard times. We want to be students during the hard times. Lord, what are you teaching me? What do you want me to take from this? This isn't going to last forever, but on the other side, how do you want me to be different? How do you want me to be able to help other people on the other side because I've gone through it? I think that's the most important lesson I've learned.
Yeah, I'm as you said that, don't waste your sufferings. I'm literally picking up my Bible as I'm talking to you and reading James 1 when it says, consider it pure joy when troubles of any kind or suffering come your way. And I think you just kind of explained right there why that is biblical just as much as it is a life lesson. This is a lesson that comes straight from the Bible and the book of James, that we're supposed to do that. Have you been able to see that in your life? Because people will look at that and say, how can you be joyful when you get a cancer diagnosis? How can you be joyful when sufferings come? How have you seen that play out in your life and the lives of others around you?
Well, Jason, a little over 8 years ago, I was sitting in the office of Dr. Robert Reynolds, and he informed me that I had cancer. I said, "I've got what?" I was stunned.
Yeah.
Absolutely stunned. I couldn't believe it. Fortunately, my wife was there, calmly taking notes on all this. But I'd been diagnosed with multiple myeloma. I'd never heard of that. One of the blood cancers. "Doc, how long do I have to live?" He said, "Well, generally 2 to 3 years. We're going to get you on some new forms of chemo. Hope to keep you alive long enough for this new chemo to come into effect." Well, I'm now in year number 9, Jason. My point in sharing that is I did not volunteer to get into the cancer world, but I'm in it.
Yeah.
I wrote a book a few years ago called The Mission is Remission. And hardly a week goes by that I'm not counseling somebody on the phone or by email. Hardly a week goes by. They reach out. They're scared. They're nervous. They're upset about what's happened to them. And I'm in a position to offer some counsel. I never could have done that if I hadn't gone through it. And now I'm grateful for that cancer experience, because the Lord now has me in the cancer counseling business, the cancer encouragement business. So I think the Lord wants us. We learn about this is to be grateful and happy in all circumstances. The Apostle Paul talks about that quite frequently. We're not always going to have perfect days, but as Coach Wooden tells us, make each day your masterpiece. Yeah. Whether everything's swimmingly perfect or whether it's a struggle, make each day your masterpiece, and we don't want to waste any of those days because no matter what's happening, they're important.
Pat Williams has been our guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast, the Senior Vice President at the Orlando Magic. The book, again, the new book called Character Carved in Stone by Pat Williams, the forward by Coach Mike Krzyzewski, the 12 core virtues of West Point that build leaders and produce success. The book is available everywhere. Books are sold right now. You can find Pat on his website, patwilliams.com, and on Facebook and Twitter. Pat, it's been a pleasure to have you back on the podcast, and hopefully a year from now you're writing book number 111 and we get you back on again. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Jason. Book 111, by the way, will be out in October.
There it is. Perfect.
It's called Lead Like Walt. We look at Walt Disney through the narrow focus of leadership. So hopefully we can chat again.
Oh, that'd be great. My daughter's hero is Walt Disney, so that'll be awesome. We can actually let her read it too. Pat, thanks so much for this, and I really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
And that was the legend himself, Pat Williams, Senior Vice President of the Orlando Magic and a true sports treasure. 51 years in the NBA, 110 books, the father of 19 children, a cancer survivor. You heard that story on the podcast, and so full of wisdom. What I'm going to do is go back and listen, and I've actually done this already with one of his quotes, but I'm going to go back and listen and literally just take notes. There's so much good stuff that he has in there, and his book is full of that too. The latest book, Character Carved in Stone, is available everywhere books are found. Amazon is probably the best place to get that, and just appreciate Pat. Every time he comes on, I feel like I'm filled up just by listening to him and asking him questions. I hope you enjoyed the interview as well. And if you did, one of the great things about this podcast and you guys listening, and listen, we've had almost 700,000 downloads of this podcast. So it's been amazing to watch the reception of this and just the audience grow. But we want to continue to reach people for Christ. And the only way we can do that really, truly is through you. So if you're listening to this podcast, please take a screenshot. Please text it. Tell your friends. Tell your neighbors. Tell different people about this podcast. Have them listen. I don't think it's an intrusive way to introduce the gospel or introduce Jesus to maybe that unsaved friend of yours or family member that loves sports. I think this is a neat way to do that. So we rely on you guys. So please do that. Please share and let people know if you feel called to do that, to let people know about this podcast. It would mean a lot to us. We also want to thank our sponsors, our partnership with Compassion International. It's $38 a month. Every child being discipled in the Word of God by you releasing them from poverty. Over 150,000 children in the last year alone have come to faith in Christ because of your sponsorship through Compassion International, releasing children from poverty in Jesus' name. Here's how you can make a difference. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum, compassion.com/sportspectrum. $38 a month. It'll be the best money you spend every single month releasing a child from poverty with Compassion International. Sponsor a child today. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Again, want to direct you to our social media pages, sports_spectrum on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We also welcome your feedback and input and ideas for this podcast. If you have an idea for this podcast, a guest idea, maybe a different type of interview that we've never done before, maybe a guest that we've heard of, but wasn't on the forefront of our minds. Maybe it's somebody that we don't know about, a small name, somebody who's doing just great things in the local community that intersects sports and faith. Please reach out. Please let us know. You can email me directly, jason@sportspectrum.com, jason@sportspectrum.com. And also check out our website. Sportspectrum.com is the main page. Daily devotionals every day at 6 a.m. An opportunity to sign up and receive our newsletter, which comes every Wednesday morning to your inbox. So that's an easy way to do that. You can go right there at sportspectrum.com and sign up for that. And then our magazine, which has been the cornerstone, the pillar of this ministry, for $18 for a whole year. $18 for an entire year. I mean, that's $20 for the whole year. People are giving $20 a month just for coffee, and we're talking about an entire year. It's your opportunity to subscribe and receive the Sports Spectrum magazine, a great tool, a great outreach periodical that you can read and then give to someone else. Perfect for a young teenager, maybe someone in youth group, a college student looking to have some extra reading and hearing and reading these stories about sports and faith. Man, we want to just point people back to Christ. That is our goal. He must increase. We must decrease. We do that with the increase in Christ through the Sports Spectrum magazine and all of what we do here at Sports Spectrum. But the magazine's a great tool. Check it out. $18. Go to sportspectrum.com and subscribe today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time with a brand new episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast. Have a great rest of your day.